The gymnasium doors were propped open at exactly 6:45 when I heard Renee's voice cut through the noise of folding chairs and proud parents. She said it loud enough for the row behind us to hear, calling me worthless in front of our daughter's own graduation crowd, right there under the paper banner that read Millbrook Valley College Class of 2026. I felt my face go hot, the way it used to 11 years ago back, when her words could still knock the air clean out of my chest. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 46 years old, and I've run the hardware store on Route 9 in Millbrook, Ohio, since my father handed me the keys the summer I turned 26. I'd arrived that morning at 5:30 to water the tomato plants on my porch before the heat came in, the way I do every morning, whether there's a graduation or not, because routines are the only thing that kept me upright those first hard years. I ironed a blue dress shirt Ava bought me for Christmas, the one with the small collar she said made me look less like a man who sold hinges for a living, and I laughed at that all morning. I stood there holding a bouquet of yellow tulips, because Ava always said yellow was the color of trying again, and I would not let Renee take that small thing away from me. Renee had flown in from Charlotte the night before, wearing a coat that cost more than my truck already. Talking to a stranger near the punch table about how small this town had made me sound when she mentioned it, she'd left when Ava was 7 years old, not with a slammed door, but with a quiet note on the kitchen table that said she needed a life bigger than casseroles. And Little League games on Saturday mornings? I remember standing in that kitchen holding the note until the coffee went cold in the pot, wondering what exactly I had done to become someone's cautionary tale after 9 years of marriage. We'd met at 23, both working summers at a lake resort too. Counties over, Renee waiting tables and me fixing the dock and the paddle boats whenever they broke down in the July heat. She used to say I was the steadiest thing she'd ever met, back before steady started sounding to her like a synonym for boring, back before the town felt like a cage instead of a home. For a long time I told myself the marriage ended because she wanted more, and I only ever wanted enough, and maybe that was true, or maybe it was just the version that let me sleep at night without blaming either one of us too hard. The last 2 years of our marriage were quiet in the worst way, the kind of quiet where two people pass butter across a table and call it conversation, where nobody fights because nobody has enough left to fight over anymore. Ava was quiet for a year after her mother left, eating grilled cheese and tomato soup at 6:15 every night because it was the only thing I knew how to make that felt like comfort instead of a chore. I learned to braid hair from a video on my phone, badly at first, my fingers too thick and clumsy for those thin elastic bands, until Denise Coleman next door showed me the trick of starting from the nape instead of the crown. Denise had moved into the blue house beside mine 4 years back, a school librarian with a laugh like a screen door in summer, and she never once tried to replace what Ava had lost in her mother. She brought over a pie with foil folded neatly over the top the week after Renee left, set it on my counter, without a word of pity in her voice, and said only that grief tastes better with something sweet nearby. I didn't fall for Denise right away. Not the way people fall in movies with a single glance across a crowded room. It was slower than that, built out of 1,000 small, unremarkable Tuesdays. She'd wave from her porch at 7 in the morning with a coffee mug in her hand, and some nights she'd sit with Ava on our front steps helping with algebra while I closed up the store 2 blocks down the road. She never asked me for anything those first 2 years, never hinted that she wanted more than the easy neighborly rhythm we'd fallen into, and that patience is what eventually taught me to trust a woman again. Researchers who study long marriages have found that couples who stay steady tend to answer each other's small bids for connection far more often than they ignore them, turning toward each other instead of away in the ordinary moments nobody remembers later. Denise answered every single bid Ava and I ever sent her way, whether it was a broken zipper, a burnt casserole, or just a porch light left on too late because neither of us wanted to be the one to turn it off first. It took me 3 years to understand that what Denise offered wasn't a rebound or a convenience. It was the kind of patient devotion the marriage counselors call the real architecture of lasting love. I remember the night Ava, 12 years old then, asked me flat out at the dinner table whether Denise was going to be her stepmother someday, and I nearly choked on my grilled cheese trying to answer honestly. I told her I didn't know, but that whatever happened, Denise had already earned a permanent seat at our table, whether or not a ring or a certificate ever made it official between us. Denise heard that story secondhand from Ava a week later, standing in her garden trimming tomato vines, and she just smiled and said permanent seats were the only kind worth keeping around a table anyway. There were harder nights, too. Nights when Ava missed her mother so badly she cried into her pillow and refused to come downstairs, and Denise never once tried to fill that particular hole, only sat outside the door until Ava was ready to open it. By the time Ava turned 16, Denise had become such a fixture in our lives that neighbors down the block simply assumed we were already married, and neither Denise nor I bothered correcting them anymore. She still kept her own house next door those years, said she wasn't in any hurry, that love built slowly tends to hold its shape longer than love built out of urgency and fear of being alone. I asked her once, half joking, if she ever worried she was wasting her best years waiting around on a man still cleaning up the wreckage of somebody else's marriage. She told me plainly that waiting wasn't the right word for it, that she'd never once felt like she was standing still, only building something with me one ordinary evening at a time. Now here we were at Ava's graduation 9 years later, Denise's hand resting light on my arm in a green dress she'd bought specifically for this day, and Renee standing 4 feet away in her expensive coat calling me worthless like no time had passed at all. She said I'd wasted 17 years selling hinges and hammers to a town that would never remember my name, and that Ava was lucky she'd escaped Millbrook's small horizons through her own hard work alone, no thanks to the man who raised her. A few heads turned near us. An usher hesitated in the aisle with a stack of programs, and I felt Ava's eyes flick toward me from her seat in the second row of graduates already dressed in cap and gown. I opened my mouth to answer, though I hadn't decided yet whether I wanted to defend myself out loud or simply let it go the way I'd practiced doing for years in that same gymnasium parking lot. Before I could speak, Denise squeezed my arm once, gentle as anything, and said to Renee in a voice too calm to be mistaken for weakness, that she was sorry Renee still carried so much anger after all this time apart. Renee blinked, clearly expecting a fight instead of grace, her mouth already halfway open with whatever line she'd rehearsed on the flight up from Charlotte the night before. Denise added quietly that anger like that usually isn't about the person standing in front of you at all. It's about the life a person imagines they might have had instead, and that kind of grief deserves sympathy more than an audience. The moment stretched thin, Renee's mouth opening and closing once more, before she muttered something about traffic from the airport and stepped back into the crowd without another word to either of us. A woman 2 rows over, someone I recognized vaguely from the church potluck circuit, leaned toward her husband and whispered that she'd never seen anyone handle an insult with that much quiet dignity in her entire life. I didn't feel triumphant watching Renee retreat, only a strange and unfamiliar calm, the kind that comes from realizing you no longer need the last word to feel like you've won anything at all. That was when the dean walked to the podium in his dark blue robe, cleared his throat, and I recognized the voice before I even lifted my head, a voice I hadn't heard outside of memory in almost 25 years. It was Thomas Reyes, my old college roommate from Ohio State, the same Tom who used to fall asleep with textbooks open on his chest at 2 in the morning, and now stood there as dean of Millbrook Valley College. We'd lost touch the way most college friendships do, a few emails after graduation, a wedding invitation I never managed to send because life got loud and complicated, and then 2 decades of silence neither of us meant to let happen. He hadn't seen me yet, scanning his notes, adjusting his glasses the exact same way he used to before an exam, and my heart did something strange and hopeful in my chest at the sight of him. Tom began reading the list of honors graduates, steady and warm, and when he reached the name Ava Marie Webb, summa cum laude, department medal in environmental science, his eyes lifted and found mine in the crowd. Instantly, he paused for half a second longer than the moment required, smiled the smile of a man recognizing an old friend across 2 and a half decades of separate lives, then kept reading with even more warmth in his voice than before. After the ceremony, he found me by the folding tables where parents were taking photographs, grabbed my shoulder with both hands, and said my name like it was still 1999, and we were still 20 years old, sharing a cramped dorm room. Tom told me he'd read Ava's senior thesis on watershed restoration twice, said the committee had never seen writing that clear and confident from an undergraduate in his 15 years at the college. He said she reminded him so much of the stubborn kid who used to fix everyone's bikes in our dorm hallway for free, refusing payment even when he desperately needed the money for textbooks. I told him that stubborn kid was me, and Tom laughed loud enough that a few graduates turned to look, saying he knew exactly where Ava got that particular streak of hers from. He asked how in the world I'd ended up raising a daughter like that on my own, and I told him the short version, the marriage that ended, the store that kept me steady through the worst years, and Denise standing quietly a few feet away holding 2 cups of lemonade like she'd known exactly to bring 2. Tom shook Denise's hand warmly and told her that back in college I used to talk about wanting a life that was small and warm instead of big and lonely, and it looked to him like I'd finally built exactly that. Renee had drifted to the edge of the crowd by then, watching the three of us laugh together near the punch bowl, and I noticed her face soften into something that looked almost like regret before she looked away toward the parking lot. Ava found us a few minutes later still in her cap and gown, hugged Tom like an old family friend she'd only just properly met that afternoon, then turned to me and said the word worthless didn't sound true coming from anyone who raised her the way I had. She said she remembered every grilled cheese sandwich, every clumsy braid, every night I sat up helping her rebuild a science fair volcano at 11 o'clock the night before it was due, and none of that felt like a wasted life to her at all. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that until my eyes went hot and Denise slipped her hand into mine without making a single show of it in front of everyone watching. Later that evening, Renee found me alone by my truck in the parking lot, arms crossed, looking smaller somehow than she had inside the gymnasium under the bright fluorescent lights an hour earlier. She said she was sorry that watching Tom recognize me the way he did had reminded her of the person she married before either of us learned how to slowly disappoint each other year after year. I asked her why she needed to call me worthless in front of 100 strangers if some small part of her still remembered who I used to be back at that lake resort 20 years ago. She admitted, quieter than I'd ever heard her sound, that watching me build a whole life without her, a daughter who loved me, a woman like Denise who chose me every single day, made her feel like the leftover instead of the reason. I told her I forgave her, not because what she said didn't sting a little, but because carrying that sting around for another decade wasn't a punishment that would ever land on her, only on me. Studies on forgiveness inside long relationships have found that people who let go of resentment tend to report better health and calmer hearts years later than those who keep score of every old wound. I wanted the calmer heart more than I wanted her to keep suffering for something that couldn't be undone by either of us standing in a parking lot arguing about it one more time. Renee asked, almost afraid of the answer, whether Ava would ever really forgive her for leaving all those years ago, and I told her that was a conversation only the two of them could have, not one I could hand her secondhand. She nodded, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and said she'd like to try calling Ava more often, not to replace anything lost, just to start somewhere small and honest between them. I told her that sounded like a decent place to begin, and for the first time in 11 years, we shook hands in a parking lot instead of arguing across a kitchen table like we used to. Denise waited by the passenger door the whole time, not because she needed to supervise the conversation, but because she trusted me enough to let it happen without hovering over either of us. When I climbed in beside her, she asked only one question, whether I was okay, and I told her. I felt lighter than I had in longer than I could honestly remember feeling. We drove home with the windows down, Ava's laughter drifting up from the back seat where she was already texting her college roommates about the barbecue planned for that coming weekend at the lake. 2 nights later, Denise and I sat on my back porch with the porch light buzzing softly and a bag of sunflower seeds between us, and she asked me plainly what I actually wanted from the next chapter of my life. I told her I wanted mornings that looked exactly like this. 1. Her slippers by my door. Coffee that stayed warm because we drank it slow instead of rushing off somewhere else entirely. She admitted she'd been scared for nearly 3 years to want more than the easy, comfortable thing we already had together, afraid that naming it out loud might somehow shrink it down to something smaller and more fragile. I told her love that shows up on a Tuesday with foil folded over a pie dish never once felt small to me. It felt like the steadiest thing I'd known since I was a boy growing up in this same town. She laughed, the screen door laugh I loved so much, and said if I was proposing marriage, I ought to at least know it clearly before I said something we couldn't take back over a bag of sunflower seeds. I told her I wasn't proposing that particular night only, promising that whatever came next, I wanted her name written into the very middle of it, not standing quietly off to the side like a guest. She reached over and took my hand the way she had at the graduation earlier that week, easy and certain, and said that was the only promise she'd ever really needed from anyone in her life. Renee called Ava for the first time in months the following week, and though the conversation was short and a little awkward at first, Ava told me it felt like an actual door opening instead of another one quietly closing between them. Tom invited me to speak to his incoming freshmen that fall about small businesses and second chances, said a man who Rebuilt a whole life out of hardware and grilled cheese had something honest worth teaching a room full of nervous 18-year-olds. I stood in the store one afternoon that August, boxing up paint cans behind the counter, when Denise walked in holding a small ring box she'd apparently been carrying around in her purse for exactly 9 nervous days. She said she'd meant to wait for some perfect moment, a sunset or a slow song, but decided the middle of an ordinary Tuesday surrounded by hardware felt more honest than anything staged or rehearsed. I laughed until I nearly dropped a can of paint, then said yes before she'd even finished asking the actual question, because some things a man simply knows the exact moment they're finally offered to him. We married the following spring in the backyard between our 2 houses, string lights strung between the porches, Ava standing beside Denise instead of behind her, calling her something closer to family than friend that whole afternoon. Renee came to the wedding, sat quietly near the back beside an aunt of mine, and afterward told me she was glad Ava had gotten the kind of steady love she herself had once been too restless to recognize when she had it. Tom gave a short toast, said he'd known me since we were 19 and broke, sharing ramen noodles in a dorm room, and that watching me marry a woman who braided hair and brought pie was the best ending to any story he'd ever gotten to read aloud. A year later, Ava brought her own boyfriend home for Thanksgiving, and Denise taught them both her mother's stuffing recipe while I stood in the doorway watching a kitchen full of the family I never thought I'd get to keep. 3 years after that, Ava called us from the hospital in Columbus to say she and her husband had a daughter, 7 pounds 2 ounces, and that they wanted to name her Dee, after the woman who braided her hair through a childhood no one else could see her through. Denise cried, holding that baby in the hospital chair, and I stood beside her thinking about pie left on a counter with foil folded neatly over the top, and how far one small kindness can travel across a whole lifetime. Renee visits twice a year now, careful and a little formal still, but present in a way she wasn't for over a decade, and Ava has slowly let her back in, an inch at a time, on her own terms. Real love, I've come to understand, isn't the loud declaration made in a crowded gymnasium. It's the quiet showing up, day after ordinary day, long after anyone is still watching or keeping any kind of score at all. You can be called worthless under bright fluorescent lights by someone who once knew you best, and still walk out that same door into a life worth every single ordinary Tuesday you're given. Millbrook is the kind of town where the diner on Main Street still serves coffee in mugs older than most of its customers, and everyone knew the Webb family long before Renee ever arrived here from the next county over. My father built that hardware store with his own 2 hands in 1978, stacking shelves of nails and paint cans until the place smelled permanently of sawdust and machine oil, a smell I still find more comforting than any cologne. When he handed me the keys the summer I turned 26, he told me the store would never make me rich, but it would make me known. And in a town this size, being known was worth more than money most days. Renee never understood that particular kind of wealth, the kind measured in regulars who trusted you to order the right size bolt for their broken porch railing without asking twice. She grew up in Cincinnati, in a house with a circular driveway and parents who traveled for work more than they stayed home. And she carried that restlessness with her the way some people carry an accent. When we first married, she used to tease me gently about my routines. The way I watered the same 3 tomato plants every morning at 5:30 regardless of the weather or the day of the week. Back then, the teasing felt fond, even flattering, like she found my steadiness charming instead of suffocating, and for the first 4 or 5 years of our marriage, I believed that would never change between us. We bought the house on Larch Street the year Ava was born, painted the nursery a pale yellow because Renee said yellow was the color of good mornings, a phrase Ava would later claim for her own reasons about trying again. Those early years were genuinely happy ones. Renee laughing in the kitchen while I burned dinner, both of us falling asleep some nights on the couch with Ava between us, too tired to make it upstairs to bed. The slow decline crept in so quietly that I couldn't have named the exact month it started, only that somewhere around Ava's 5th birthday, Renee began mentioning other places we could live as though Millbrook were a temporary arrangement rather than a home. She'd bring home brochures for cities I'd never been to, ask questions about whether the store could run itself for a year while we tried something different somewhere warmer, somewhere bigger, somewhere she imagined might finally fit the life she'd pictured for herself. I always answered honestly that I couldn't leave, that my father's store and my father's town were stitched too deeply into who I was. And each honest answer seemed to widen the distance between us by another careful inch. We stopped fighting about it eventually, not because we resolved anything, but because both of us grew tired of having the same conversation with no new ending, and quiet resignation is its own kind of slow ending to a marriage. The night she actually left, I came home from the store around 7 to find Ava already fed, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-finished coloring book, asking where Mommy had gone in such a hurry that afternoon. I found the note propped against the sugar bowl, folded once, her handwriting steady and almost too neat for what it said, explaining that she needed a life bigger than casseroles and Little League games on Saturday mornings. I read it maybe a dozen times standing at that counter, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less final, the way you keep checking a door hoping it will unlock itself if you try the handle enough times. Ava asked me twice that night if her mother was coming back for bedtime, and I told her Mommy needed some time away, a phrase I'd chosen carefully because I didn't yet have the words to explain something I'd barely understood myself. The town found out within a week, the way small towns always do, and I remember Mrs. Alders from the church bringing over a casserole dish with a note that just said, "We're praying for you both." No questions attached to it at all. Some people offered advice I never asked for, telling me I should fight to get her back, or that I should be relieved, as though grief could be sorted so neatly into categories by people standing outside of it. I didn't want her back. Not really, not even in those first raw weeks, though I did mourn the version of our marriage from those early good years, the one that existed before the slow drift set in. What I mourned most was the version of myself that had believed steadiness alone would always be enough to hold two people together no matter how differently they wanted to spend their one life. Ava stopped talking much for almost a year afterward, answering questions with single words, drawing pictures of our house with only 2 figures in them instead of 3, which broke something quiet in me every time I found one taped to the refrigerator. I took her to a counselor in the next town over, a kind woman named Dr. Patterson, who told me grief in children often looks like silence rather than tears, and that consistency mattered more right now than any perfect words I might try to offer. So I gave her consistency, grilled cheese and tomato soup at 6:15 every single night, the same 2 library books read aloud before bed, the same porch light left on until she fell asleep, small anchors in a year that had otherwise come completely unmoored. It was during that hard first year that Denise Coleman properly entered our lives, though I'd nodded to her over the fence 100 times before without ever really seeing her clearly. She'd moved into the blue house next door with her cat and 3 towering bookshelves the same autumn Ava started kindergarten, taking a job as the school librarian at the elementary building 2 blocks from our house. The week after Renee left, Denise appeared at my door holding a pie with foil folded neatly over the top, said she'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine, and figured a man raising a 7-year-old alone could probably use dessert more than sympathy. She didn't ask a single prying question that evening, didn't offer any unsolicited theories about where Renee had gone or why, just handed me the pie and said she was 2 doors down if I ever needed an extra set of hands for anything at all. I took her up on that offer more than I ever expected to, mostly small things at first. A jar lid I couldn't twist off after a long shift, a school project Ava needed poster board for that I'd forgotten to buy. Denise never made those small favors feel like burdens, and slowly, without either of us naming it out loud, she became a fixture at our kitchen table 2 or 3 evenings a week, helping with homework, teaching me recipes that went beyond grilled cheese. She taught me how to braid Ava's hair properly one Sunday afternoon, sitting behind her on our porch steps, showing me the trick of starting the braid from the nape of the neck instead of fighting with it from the crown the way I'd been doing badly for months. Ava adored her almost immediately, the uncomplicated way children adore adults who simply show up without an agenda, and I watched that bond grow with a mixture of gratitude and quiet, unspoken hope I didn't dare examine too closely at first. It took me a full 2 years to admit to myself that what I felt for Denise wasn't gratitude alone, that I looked forward to her porch light switching on in the evenings more than I looked forward to almost anything else in my day. I was terrified of ruining what we had by naming it, terrified that if I asked for more, I might lose the steady, easy comfort we'd built one unremarkable evening at a time over those first 2 careful years. Data on repartnering after a marriage ends shows that many people who separate later in life do eventually build new committed relationships, often with someone who was already present in their daily orbit rather than someone entirely new. That statistic, when I first read it years later in a magazine at the barbershop, made something in my chest settle, as though Denise and I weren't some unlikely exception, but part of a quieter, more common story than I'd realized. I finally worked up the nerve to ask Denise to an actual dinner, not a neighborly favor but a real date. The autumn Ava turned 9, driving us both nearly 45 minutes to the one nice restaurant in the county because I didn't trust myself not to blush in front of anyone we knew locally. She laughed at how nervous I was, said she'd been waiting 2 years for me to catch up to something. She'd already quietly decided a long time before that dinner ever happened. We took things slow after that, by mutual agreement, both wary of upending Ava's fragile new stability, both aware that whatever we built needed to be sturdy enough to hold a child's trust as well as our own. Denise kept her own house those years even as she spent more nights at ours than her own, said she wasn't in any hurry, that love built slowly tends to hold its shape and its foundation longer than love rushed together out of loneliness or fear. There were harder nights during those years too, nights Ava missed her mother so fiercely she cried into her pillow and refused to come downstairs for dinner, and Denise never once tried to fill that particular hole in her, only sat quietly outside the closed door until Ava was ready to open it herself. By the time Ava turned 16, Denise had become such a fixture in both our lives that neighbors down the block simply assumed we were already married, and neither of us bothered correcting the assumption anymore, letting it stand as a kind of quiet truth. I asked her once, half joking on the porch one summer evening, if she ever worried she was wasting her best years waiting around on a man still slowly cleaning up the wreckage of somebody else's marriage. She told me plainly that waiting wasn't the right word for what she'd been doing, that she'd never once felt like she was standing still, only building something steady with me one ordinary evening at a time, brick by unremarkable brick. The morning of Ava's graduation, Denise pressed my shirt collar flat with her thumb in the hallway mirror and told me that whatever happened that day, whatever Renee said or didn't say, I should remember that Ava already knew exactly who her father was. I told her I wasn't worried about Renee, though we both knew that was only half true, old wounds having a way of aching again the moment the person who caused them walks back into the room after years away. Denise reminded me, tying her own hair back in the mirror beside me, that Renee's opinion of my life had stopped being any real measure of its worth a very long time ago, somewhere back around the 3rd or 4th year we'd spent quietly building this one together. We drove to the college with the windows cracked, Ava's old car seat still folded in the trunk from years ago because neither of us had ever gotten around to donating it, a small relic of the child she used to be. The campus was busy with families setting up lawn chairs and balloons, and I spotted Renee almost immediately near the gymnasium entrance, taller somehow than I remembered, dressed like she'd stepped out of a magazine rather than a graduation crowd in small-town Ohio. She hugged Ava first, stiffly, the kind of hug that measures the distance it's trying to close rather than actually closing it, and I watched Ava's shoulders tense the exact same way they used to when she was 7 years old and unsure. I greeted Renee with a nod and a hello, kept my voice level the way I'd practiced in the truck mirror more times than I'd ever admit out loud to Denise or anyone else. It was in the crowded lobby, waiting for the doors to open, that Renee made her first comment, something small about how the store must be doing well if I could afford a whole afternoon off in the middle of a weekday. I let it slide, told myself she was nervous too, that graduations have a way of surfacing old feelings nobody quite knows what to do with once they resurface after years of silence. But by the time we were seated, waiting for the ceremony to begin, her voice had climbed louder and sharper, circling closer to the words that would eventually spill out in front of the entire gathered crowd around us. After the ceremony, once the crowd had thinned and the folding chairs were being stacked away by tired student volunteers, Tom insisted we all go get dinner together at the one steakhouse in town that stayed open past 9 on weekends. He said it felt wrong to let 25 years of lost time end with just a handshake in a parking lot, especially now that he'd finally found me again, after all these years of wondering what had become of his old college roommate. Over dinner he told me about his own path, a divorce of his own in his 30s, years spent building the academic career that eventually led him back to a small college not unlike the one we'd attended together as broke 20-year-olds. He said watching me that afternoon, steady and calm in the face of Renee's cruelty, reminded him why he'd always admired me back in college, long before either of us had any real reason yet to be admired for anything at all. Denise sat beside me through dinner, quiet mostly, letting Tom and I trade old stories, though she laughed harder than anyone when Tom described the time I'd tried and failed to fix our dorm room's ancient radiator with duct tape and stubbornness alone. Ava asked Tom question after question about the environmental science program, practically glowing under his attention, and I realized watching them talk that this dinner had given her something rare, a mentor who saw her potential as clearly as I always had. Tom told her, seriously, that the program wanted to keep her on for a summer research fellowship studying the watershed that fed into the river running through 3 counties, including our own. Ava looked at me first before answering the way she'd done since she was small, checking whether staying close to home for one more summer was something I actually wanted for her too, or just something she assumed I expected. I told her the only thing I ever wanted was for her to build a life that felt like hers, whether that meant staying in Millbrook or moving clear across the country to do it. She hugged me across the table hard enough to rattle the silverware, and Tom laughed and said he could see exactly why she'd turned out the way she had, stubborn and warm in equal measure. Renee wasn't at that dinner, having left the campus quietly sometime after the ceremony ended, and it wasn't until later that evening in the parking lot that I saw her again, alone by my truck, arms crossed against the early evening chill. That conversation, the one where she finally apologized, didn't erase 11 years of hurt in a single exchange, but it did open a door neither of us had touched in over a decade of careful, deliberate silence. In the weeks that followed, Renee kept her word about calling Ava more often, awkward at first, both of them relearning a rhythm that had gone quiet for far too long to simply resume where it left off. Ava told me after one of those calls that her mother had asked, hesitantly, whether she could maybe visit sometime that summer, not to make up for lost years all at once, but to start somewhere small and honest between them. I told Ava the decision was entirely hers to make, that forgiveness offered on her own timeline meant more than forgiveness rushed to satisfy anyone else's comfort, including mine or Renee's. She decided, after thinking it over for nearly a month, to invite Renee up for a single weekend that July, cautious but willing to see what an honest, unhurried visit might actually look like between them. Denise offered to make herself scarce that weekend, said she didn't want her presence to complicate whatever fragile thing Ava and Renee were trying to rebuild, but Ava insisted she stay, said Denise was as much a part of the family as anyone. That weekend went better than any of us expected, careful and a little formal at times, but warm in places too, Renee asking real questions about Ava's research fellowship and actually listening to the answers instead of steering the conversation back toward herself. Watching them sit together on the porch that Saturday evening, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for over a decade, a knot I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying around every single day. 2 nights after the graduation, before Renee's visit had even been arranged, Denise and I sat on my back porch with the porch light buzzing softly and a bag of sunflower seeds open between us on the small wooden table my father had built decades earlier. She asked me, plainly, no preamble at all, what I actually wanted from the next chapter of my life, now that Ava was graduated and the house would soon feel quieter than it had in 18 years. I told her I wanted mornings that looked exactly like this one, her slippers by my door, coffee that stayed warm because we drank it slow instead of rushing off somewhere else entirely different. She admitted she'd been scared for nearly 3 years to want more than the easy, comfortable thing we already had together, afraid that naming it out loud might somehow shrink it down to something smaller and more fragile than it actually was. I asked her what exactly she thought naming it might cost us, and she said, honestly, that she'd watched enough friends rush toward marriage only to discover the rushing itself had been the best part, the commitment afterward flattening into something ordinary and disappointing. I told her our whole relationship had already been built the opposite way, slow and deliberate, tested by hard years, and a child's grief and 100 quiet Tuesdays. And that kind of foundation doesn't flatten the same way rushed love sometimes does. She was quiet for a moment, turning a sunflower seed over in her fingers, then asked if I was afraid of anything myself, given everything I'd already survived once before with Renee. I admitted I was afraid a little that loving someone fully again meant handing over the same vulnerability that had once left me standing in a kitchen holding a folded note until the coffee went cold. Denise reached over and took my hand then, said she. Couldn't promise she'd never disappoint me. Nobody honest could promise a thing like that. But she could promise she'd never leave a note on a counter and vanish without a real conversation first. I told her love that shows up on a Tuesday with foil folded over a pie dish never once felt small to me. It felt like the steadiest thing I'd known since I was a boy fishing with my father on the river 2 counties over. She laughed, the screen door laugh I loved so much, and said if I was working my way toward a proposal I ought to at least know it clearly before I said something neither of us could take back over a bag of sunflower seeds on a Tuesday night. I told her I wasn't proposing that particular evening, only promising that whatever came next, I wanted her name written into the very middle of it, not standing quietly off to the side the way a guest might. She reached over and squeezed my hand the way she had at the graduation earlier that week, easy and certain, and said that promise alone was the only thing she'd ever really needed to hear from anyone in her whole life. Tom invited me to speak to his incoming freshmen that fall about small businesses and second chances, said a man who rebuilt a whole life out of hardware and grilled cheese sandwiches had something honest worth teaching a room full of nervous 18-year-olds still finding their footing. I stood in front of that lecture hall in September, sweating through my one good shirt, telling 100 strangers about the store my father built, the marriage that ended, and the neighbor who taught me to braid hair badly at first and love steadily ever since. Afterward, a student came up to me, said her own parents had divorced 2 years earlier, and asked quietly whether it ever really got easier watching a family rearrange itself into something new and unfamiliar. I told her honestly that it doesn't get easier so much as it gets different. That new shapes of family can hold just as much warmth as the old ones, sometimes even more, once everyone stops grieving the shape they expected instead. Tom watched that exchange from the back of the room, and afterward told me over coffee that watching me talk to that student reminded him why he'd gone into education in the first place, to help people build something steady out of whatever pieces they'd been handed. He told me his own divorce years earlier had taught him something similar, that the people who rebuild the most honest lives afterward are rarely the ones who rush toward the next thing, but the ones patient enough to let the next thing arrive on its own timeline. I thought about that conversation for weeks afterward, turning it over the way Denise turned sunflower seeds over in her fingers until one afternoon in the store it all crystallized into something I finally felt ready to act on. I stood in the store one afternoon that August, boxing up paint cans behind the counter while old Mr. Halloran argued cheerfully with me about the price of a replacement screen door hinge, when Denise walked in holding a small ring box she'd apparently been carrying in her purse for exactly 9 nervous days. Mr. Halloran, sensing something was happening, quietly excused himself toward the paint aisle, pretending to study primer colors he had no actual intention of buying that day. Denise said she'd meant to wait for some perfect moment, a sunset over the lake or a slow song at a restaurant somewhere, but decided the middle of an ordinary Tuesday surrounded by hardware felt more honest than anything staged or carefully rehearsed in advance. She said she'd watched me build steadiness out of chaos for 9 years. Running, watched me braid hair and burn dinner and raise a daughter who turned out remarkable, and she didn't want to wait one more ordinary Tuesday to make it official between us. I laughed until I nearly dropped a can of paint onto my own boot, then said yes before she'd even finished asking the actual question, because some things a man simply knows the exact moment they're finally, plainly offered to him. Mr. Halloran, still pretending to study primer colors, called out congratulations from the paint aisle without even turning around, and the whole store seemed to exhale with us in that strange, wonderful moment. Word spread through Millbrook within the day the way news always does in a town this size, and by evening half our neighbors had already stopped by with casseroles and congratulations tangled together in the same sentence. Ava, home for the summer between her fellowship and the fall semester of a graduate program she'd just been accepted into, cried when I told her, said she'd been hoping for this exact thing since she was maybe 11 years old and too shy to say so out loud. We married the following spring in the backyard. Between our 2 houses, string lights strung between the porches, folding chairs borrowed from the very church that had once brought us casseroles during the hardest year of our lives. Ava stood beside Denise instead of behind her, calling her something closer to family than friend that whole afternoon, her graduate program allowing her just enough of a break to fly home for the ceremony. Renee came to the wedding, sat quietly near the back beside an aunt of mine, dressed simply for once, and afterward told me she was glad Ava had gotten the kind of steady love she herself had once been too restless to recognize when she'd had it years earlier. Tom gave a short toast, said he'd known me since we were 19 and broke, sharing ramen noodles in a cramped dorm room neither of us could really afford to heat properly in the Ohio winters. He said watching me marry a woman who braided hair and brought pie with foil folded over the top was the best ending to any story he'd ever gotten to read aloud, and he raised his glass to slow, steady, unglamorous love. Denise's own family, a sister and 2 nieces, who'd driven up from Kentucky, sat mixed in among mine, and by the time dinner was served, nobody could quite tell anymore whose family was whose, which felt like exactly the right kind of blending. We danced that evening on a patch of grass between our two old houses, under string lights Ava had helped hang the week before, and I thought about the note on the kitchen counter and how far a life can travel from its hardest single moment. Denise whispered against my shoulder during that first dance that she'd never once regretted a single slow Tuesday. It took us to arrive at that particular evening, and I told her neither had I. Not for one single second of any of it. A year later, Ava brought her own boyfriend home for Thanksgiving, a quiet engineer named Sam she'd met during her graduate program, and Denise taught them both her mother's stuffing recipe, while I stood in the doorway watching a kitchen full of the family I never thought I'd get to keep. After that long, hard first year alone, Renee called that Thanksgiving morning, careful still but warmer than she'd sounded in years, asked to speak with Ava for a few minutes, and I heard real laughter drifting from the other room by the time the call ended. 2 years after the wedding, Tom retired from his role as dean, taking a smaller teaching position instead, said he wanted more time to fish the same river Ava had studied for her thesis, and he invited Denise and me out on his old boat most Saturday mornings that following summer. 3 years after the wedding, Ava called us from a hospital in Columbus to say she and Sam had a daughter, 7 pounds 2 ounces, and that they wanted to name her Dee, after the woman who'd braided her hair through a childhood no one else had fully seen her through. Denise cried, holding that baby in the hospital chair, careful and overwhelmed all at once, and I stood beside her thinking about a pie left on a counter 9 years earlier, and how far one small, unremarkable kindness can travel across an entire lifetime. Renee visits twice a year now, careful and a little formal still, driving up from Charlotte each spring and each Christmas, present in a way she wasn't for over a decade, and Ava has slowly let her back in, an inch at a time, entirely on her own terms and timeline. Little Dee calls Denise Grandma Dee without anyone ever having to teach her the word, the way children simply know instinctively who belongs to them and who has earned that particular kind of permanent place at the table. The store on Route 9 is still standing, still smelling of sawdust and machine oil, and these days I let Ava's old research colleague run the counter some afternoons so Denise and I can babysit Dee, teaching her badly to braid her own dolls' hair the exact same clumsy way I once learned. Looking back now, 5 years past that graduation day, I understand something I couldn't have explained. Standing in that gymnasium with my face hot and a bouquet of yellow tulips trembling slightly in my hand, Renee's words that afternoon weren't really about me at all. They were about a life she'd once imagined for herself and quietly lost somewhere along the way, a grief she'd never fully learned how to carry without occasionally setting it down on someone else's shoulders. I don't carry any resentment toward her now, not because what she said that day didn't sting, but because I finally understood the way research on long relationships has quietly confirmed that people who release old grievances tend to build calmer, steadier lives than those who keep relentless score of every old wound. Tom still calls every few weeks, and last spring he officiated a small vow renewal for Denise and me on our 10th anniversary together, right there on the same patch of grass between our two old houses where string lights had once hung for our wedding. Ava, now finishing her doctorate, tells Dee stories about the science fair volcano her grandfather helped her rebuild at 11 o'clock at night, and about the pie a kind neighbor once brought over with foil folded neatly across the top of the dish. Denise still waves from her old porch some mornings out of pure habit, coffee mug in hand, even though her slippers have long since moved permanently into my hallway closet beside my own worn work boots. Real love, I've come to understand fully now, isn't the loud declaration made in a crowded gymnasium under bright fluorescent lights. It's the quiet showing up, day after ordinary day, long after anyone is still watching or keeping any kind of score at all. You can be called worthless by someone who once knew you best, standing under a paper banner celebrating your own daughter's honors, and still walk out that same gymnasium door into a life worth every single ordinary Tuesday you're given afterward. Yes, I forgave her. Yes, I moved forward. Yes, I built something steadier than anything I'd ever imagined possible standing alone in that quiet kitchen holding a folded note until the coffee went cold. Denise rarely talked about her own past those first years, and it wasn't until our 3rd year of quietly dating that she finally told me why a woman as warm and steady as her had arrived in Millbrook alone. At 34, with only a cat and 3 towering bookshelves to her name. She'd been engaged once, back in her 20s, to a man who kept promising a wedding date and then quietly moving it further away each time the calendar actually approached it, until she finally understood the date was never coming at all. She said she'd learned from that experience to distrust big declarations, grand gestures that dissolved the moment real commitment was actually required. And that lesson was part of why she never once pushed me to move faster than I was ready for. When she finally left that relationship, she took a librarian position 2 states away from her family just to put distance between herself and a life that had quietly stalled out for 6 wasted years. She told me Millbrook had felt like exactly the right kind of small when she arrived, close enough to breathe, quiet enough to rebuild in, and she never expected the house next door to hold the next real chapter of her life. I asked her once if she regretted those 6 years spent waiting on a man who never delivered what he promised, and she said no, because that disappointment had taught her exactly what patient, honest love was supposed to feel like once she finally found it. She recognized that difference in me slowly, she said, in the way I showed up consistently without asking anything of her in return, in the pie dish I always washed and returned the very same week instead of letting it sit forgotten on my counter. That consistency, small and unglamorous as it seemed, was the thing that eventually convinced her Millbrook wasn't just a place to rebuild alone, but a place where she might actually be allowed to build something with someone else again. Ava's early years alone with me were harder than I usually let on when people ask about them, especially those first 2 years before Denise became a steady daily presence rather than just a kind neighbor 2 doors down. I remember missing an entire half day of work when Ava was 8 because she woke up sick, and Mr. Halloran covered the counter without complaint, refusing to accept a dime of extra pay for the trouble it caused him. The women from the church took turns those early years leaving meals on my porch some evenings without ever knocking, a quiet, practical kindness that asked nothing of me except that I eventually pay it forward to someone else someday. Research on single-parent households has found that children generally do better when at least one consistent, emotionally present adult remains steady in their daily life, regardless of how many parents happen to be in the home at any given time. I didn't know that research existed back then, but I understood its truth. Instinctively, every single night I made grilled cheese at 6:15. Every night I read the same 2 library books aloud until Ava finally fell asleep against my shoulder. Ava struggled some years in school, not academically, but socially, wary of forming close friendships the way children sometimes are after watching one parent simply disappear from daily life without warning. Her 4th grade teacher pulled me aside one October to say Ava had drawn a family portrait with only 2 figures in it, the same worry I'd already noticed taped to our own refrigerator more times than I wanted to admit out loud. It was Denise, patient afternoon after patient afternoon at our kitchen table, who slowly coaxed Ava back into trusting that people could stay if you let them, one small proven promise kept at a time. By the time Ava reached middle school, she'd become fiercely protective of the family she and I had built together, quick to correct anyone who assumed our small household was somehow incomplete or lacking compared to families with 2 parents under one roof. I remember a classmate once asking her, not unkindly, whether it made her sad not having a mother around, and Ava reportedly answered that she had a father who braided hair and a neighbor who brought pie, and that sounded like plenty to her. That story got back to me through another parent at a school function, and I had to excuse myself to the restroom for a few minutes just to compose myself before rejoining the crowd. High school brought its own challenges, the ordinary teenage kind, arguments over curfews, and a brief stretch where Ava barely spoke to either Denise or me except in short, irritated sentences typical of any 16-year-old finding her own independence. Denise never took those irritable teenage years personally, said she remembered being 16 herself once, and that the surest sign a child trusts you completely is how comfortable they feel being genuinely annoyed with you without any real fear of losing you. Ava's college acceptance letter arrived the spring she turned 18, and I watched her read it twice at our kitchen table before she looked up at both of us, with tears already gathering in her eyes. She said the environmental science program felt like the right fit because of a summer she'd spent as a girl wading in the river with me, learning the names of fish and insects I'd learned myself from my own father decades earlier. Denise drove her the 2 hours to campus that August. Insisted on it, actually, said fathers cry too easily during drop-offs, and someone steady needed to be behind the wheel for the drive back home alone afterward. College brought its own quiet worries, the kind every parent carries once a child moves out from under their daily roof, though. Ava called most Sunday evenings without fail, a habit Denise had gently suggested, and Ava had adopted without complaint. She told us about failed exams and successful ones, about a roommate who played music too loud, about professors who challenged her in ways her small high school never quite managed too, and slowly her voice on those calls grew more confident with each passing semester. It was during her sophomore year that Tom Reyes, though we didn't yet know the connection between us, became her academic advisor, recognizing early on the same stubborn brightness I'd apparently carried myself 25 years. Earlier, in that same college's dorm hallways, Ava mentioned him occasionally on those Sunday calls, said her advisor pushed her harder than any teacher ever had, never once suspecting that the man pushing her was the same roommate I used to argue with over broken radiators and unpaid pizza bills. When her senior thesis on watershed restoration was accepted for the department's highest honors, she called us practically shouting into the phone, and neither Denise nor I had any idea yet how that same thesis would reintroduce me to an old friend I'd lost track of decades earlier. Those 4 years of college calls, birthday visits, and holiday homecomings taught me that raising a child well was never really about preventing every possible hurt, but about building enough steady trust that she'd always call home first when something good or something hard happened to her. The morning after our wedding, Denise and I drove 3 hours to a small cabin on a lake for what we jokingly called our honeymoon. Modest by most standards, but exactly what both of us actually wanted after years of careful, patient waiting. We fished off the dock the way I once fixed paddle boats for a living 20 years earlier, and Denise, it turned out, was considerably better at baiting a hook than I'd ever given her credit for during all our years as neighbors. We talked for hours those 3 days about nothing important at all. Old childhood stories, favorite foods, small dreams neither of us had voiced out loud before, filling in decades of gaps 2 careful neighbors don't usually get around to sharing. She told me she wanted to plant a real garden behind our combined houses that next spring, something bigger than her tomato patch, and I told her I'd build the raised beds myself with lumber from the store, the way my father once taught me to build anything worth keeping around for years. We came home from that lake cabin sunburned and unhurried, and Eva met us at the house with a hand-painted sign reading "Welcome home, Mr. and Mrs. Webb Coleman," a hyphenated name Denise had insisted on the moment the marriage license was actually finalized. That small sign still hangs in our kitchen today, a little faded now from years near the stove, right beside a photograph of the pie dish Denise brought over the week after Renee first left all those years ago. Tom and I met the very first week of college, both assigned to the same cramped dorm room on the 3rd floor of a building with a radiator that clanged all winter long, no matter how many times maintenance promised to fix it. He was studying environmental policy even then, always scribbling notes in margins, while I drifted through 2 years undecided before settling on business, mostly because it seemed the most useful path back toward my father's store someday. We became close the way college roommates sometimes do, through shared poverty more than shared interests at first, splitting a single box of instant noodles most weeks toward the end of any given month. Tom used to say I fixed things nobody else bothered trying to fix, bikes, radios, the ancient window unit that rattled through every August, and he'd tease me that I was wasting a business degree on being the dorm's unofficial handyman. I used to tell him he'd make a terrible professor someday because he fell asleep mid-sentence over his own textbooks nearly every single night, and we'd both laugh about it, never once imagining he'd end up a dean by 50. We lost touch gradually after graduation, the way most college friendships fade, a few scattered emails about job offers and early relationships, and then simply nothing at all for over 2 decades of separate, busy lives. Standing in that gymnasium hearing his voice again after 25 years felt like finding a photograph you'd forgotten you'd taken, familiar and surprising all at once, proof that some friendships survive dormant rather than dying outright. He told me later over dinner that he'd thought of me occasionally over the years, wondered if I'd ever gone back to the store, wondered if the stubborn kid who fixed everyone's bikes for free had found whatever steady life he'd always seemed to be chasing. The gymnasium confrontation itself, looking back on it now, unfolded in barely 90 seconds from Renee's first cutting remark to Denise's quiet response, though it felt at the time like it stretched across several long, humiliating minutes in front of every parent in that crowd. Renee had leaned close, voice pitched just loud enough to carry, and said something about how she'd heard I still lived in the same small house, still drove the same old truck, still measured a whole life by the width of one small-town hardware store. She said Ava's success this afternoon belonged entirely to her own ambition and drive, inherited, she implied, from a mother who'd once had the courage to leave a life that was quietly suffocating her, rather than from a father who'd simply stayed put and called it virtue. I felt the old shame rising in my chest exactly the way it used to during our marriage, that particular flavor of doubt that made me wonder for just a moment if she might actually be right about all of it. It was Denise's hand on my arm, steady and warm, that pulled me back from that familiar spiral, reminding me without a single word that doubt inherited from an old marriage doesn't have to define the new life built carefully afterward. When Denise finally spoke, her voice calm and almost gentle, she didn't defend me directly at all. She simply named the grief sitting quietly underneath Renee's cruelty, and that naming did more to disarm the moment than any counter-argument ever could have. Renee's silence afterward wasn't defeat exactly, more like recognition, the look of someone catching a glimpse of themselves in a mirror they hadn't expected to walk past that particular afternoon. I've thought about that 90 seconds many times since, how the whole shape of that day, and in some ways the shape of everything that followed it, hinged on Denise choosing grace over triumph in a moment that would have forgiven either response completely. People sometimes ask me now, 5 years in a marriage and a granddaughter later, whether I ever wanted to say something sharper back to Renee in that gymnasium, something that might have actually stung the way her words had stung me for so many years. I tell them honestly that I did want to, for about half a second, before I remembered that the version of myself who needed the last word had mostly died somewhere back around Ava's 10th birthday, worn down by years of quiet, patient rebuilding. Holding my tongue that day wasn't weakness. And it wasn't even really restraint in the disciplined sense people sometimes imagine. It was simply the natural result of having built a life sturdy enough that one cruel sentence could no longer knock it over. Denise says the same thing about her own response that afternoon, that grace wasn't a performance she put on for the crowd watching us. It was just the honest shape her feelings had taken after years of watching Renee's absence and my steadiness from 2 doors down. Ava has told me since that watching the two of us handle that moment taught her something about marriage. She says she'll carry into her own, that the strongest response to cruelty usually isn't a louder cruelty in return, but a steadier kind of quiet altogether. I think about my father sometimes too in moments like that one, how he used to say a good hinge doesn't announce itself, it simply holds the door exactly where it's supposed to be, day after day, without anyone noticing it's even there at all. That's what Denise has been for this family since the week she brought over that first pie, an honest hinge holding a door steady that once seemed like it might swing wide open and never properly close again. And that, more than any wedding or any graduation or any dean's warm recognition across a crowded gymnasium, is the real ending to this whole story, the ordinary, unremarkable steadiness that outlasts every loud thing said against it. Millbrook itself changed some over those years too, a new coffee shop opening where the old shoe repair used to be, the elementary school getting a fresh coat of paint the same summer Ava graduated high school. Small signs of a town that kept moving forward even while certain families inside it worked through their own private seasons of grief and repair. Mr. Halloran retired from bothering me at the counter 2 years ago though. He still stops by most Fridays just to argue cheerfully about paint prices with whoever happens to be working that particular shift. The church that once left casseroles on my porch without knocking now hosts Ava and Sam's daughter for the same toddler story hour Ava herself attended as a little girl. Taught these days by a volunteer who remembers Ava as a quiet 7-year-old drawing pictures with only 2 figures in them. I still water the same 3 tomato plants every morning at 5:30, though there are 4 plants now since Denise added her own favorite variety to spring after our wedding, and neither of us has ever bothered thinning them back down. Denise still works part-time at the elementary library, though she jokes some mornings that she's slowly training her own replacement, a younger teacher who reminds her, she says, of exactly how nervous and unsure she felt arriving in this town all those years ago. Tom fishes with us most Saturday mornings still, though these days he brings his own grandchildren along too, and the 2 families have folded into each other so naturally that nobody remembers anymore whose idea the standing Saturday tradition originally was. Renee, for her part, has slowly built her own quieter life back in Charlotte, remarried briefly and divorced again, and told Ava during one recent visit that watching us all those years taught her something true about the kind of love she'd want if she ever tried again. She said she wasn't sure yet if she was ready to try, but that she finally understood what she'd been missing all those years wasn't a bigger life at all, just a steadier one, built patiently instead of chased after. Ava told her that understanding, even arriving this late, still counted for something. And I think that's true of most of the hard lessons any of us eventually learn about love, that lateness doesn't erase the value of Finally arriving somewhere honest. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this story to carry away with them, it's that the life people mock, as small, a hardware store, a modest house, a town most people drive straight through without stopping, can still hold everything worth having if you're patient enough to build it honestly. Worthless was the word Renee chose that afternoon in the gymnasium, and for exactly 90 seconds it landed the way old wounds always do, deep and sudden and disorienting no matter how many years have passed since they were first inflicted on you. But a word spoken under bright fluorescent lights by someone measuring your life against a version of success she once wanted for herself doesn't actually get the final say over what your life has quietly become. Mine became a daughter who defended me without hesitation, a friend rediscovered after 25 years, standing at a podium in a dark blue robe, and a woman 2 doors down who brought pie before she ever asked a single question. It became a granddaughter who calls my wife Grandma D without anyone teaching her the word, and an ex-wife slowly finding her own honest way back toward the daughter she once left behind on a quiet kitchen table. None of that arrived quickly, and none of it arrived because I fought loudly for it in any parking lot or gymnasium aisle. It arrived because I kept showing up, ordinary Tuesday after ordinary Tuesday, long after anyone was still watching to see if I would. That, more than any single moment of grace or forgiveness or vindication, is the real shape of the second chance this whole story was always actually about. Patient, unglamorous, and entirely worth every year it took to build. There's a photograph on our refrigerator now, taken the afternoon of Ava's graduation before any of the trouble started. The 4 of us, Ava, Denise, Tom, and me, squinting into the sun outside the gymnasium doors with the paper banner just visible behind us. I look at it sometimes on ordinary mornings while the coffee brews, and I think about how close that whole afternoon came to being remembered only for the cruelty in it, if Denise hadn't chosen grace, if Tom hadn't happened to glance up at exactly the right second, if Ava hadn't decided years earlier that her father's steadiness meant more to her than any louder version of success. Small towns like Millbrook don't often make the news, don't often get written about, but I've come to believe the quietest places hold some of the sturdiest love, precisely because there's nowhere to hide from each other, no crowd large enough to disappear into when things get hard. Denise says the same thing about libraries, that the quietest rooms often hold the most patient kind of care, shelves organized and waiting, ready for whoever eventually walks in needing exactly the right book at exactly the right moment. I think that's what she was for Ava and me those first hard years. A patient shelf waiting nearby, never demanding to be noticed, simply present and steady until we were finally ready to reach for her. And I think that's what this whole story ultimately comes down to, not the cruelty at the graduation, not even the old friend recognizing me across a crowded gymnasium, but the slow, unremarkable decision 2 people made over and over to keep choosing each other on every ordinary Tuesday they were given. That decision, repeated quietly enough times, is what any lasting love actually is, and it's worth more than every hurtful word spoken under any bright light by anyone still measuring a life by the wrong yardstick entirely. Sometimes late at night, Denise and I sit on that same back porch, older now, sunflower seeds mostly replaced by decaf these days, and we talk about D's first steps, or Ava's dissertation defense, or whatever small worry happens to be sitting closest to the surface that particular evening. Those conversations rarely feel dramatic. No grand declarations, no gymnasium crowds watching, just 2 people who've chosen each other steadily enough times that choosing has become as natural as breathing between us now. I still think about that folded note on the kitchen counter sometimes, not with the old sting it once carried, but almost with gratitude, strange as that sounds, because without that particular ending, I might never have opened myself up to whatever Denise was quietly offering. 2 doors down all those years. Renee and I speak occasionally now too, mostly logistics around holidays or Dee's birthday, but there's an ease to it that never existed during our marriage. An ease I think only comes once 2 people finally stop needing anything more from each other than simple decency. Ava tells me she's planning to bring Dee by the store this weekend, wants her to see where her grandfather learned to fix things nobody else bothered trying, wants her to smell the sawdust and machine oil that somehow still feels like home to all of us. I'll teach her badly to braid a doll's hair the same clumsy way I once learned from a video on my phone, and Denise will correct us both from the doorway, laughing the same screen door laugh that first caught my attention on an ordinary Tuesday morning years and years ago now.